Well, Richard, do you think it's almost time?
I think it's time. Here comes
And
Andrew. That means it's time.
lots to discuss as usual. And for our top story, plants in the UK apparently are flowering a month earlier than usual, and it's due to climate change. In technology, DeepMind's AI programming tool AlphaCode tests in the top 54% of human coders. What's that going to do to people who do coding? In environment, apparently plant-based diets plus rewilding provides massive opportunity to cut carbon dioxide. And Richard says then we know now what to do, but getting people to do it is the problem. Under materials, a two-dimensional polymer helps create a new lightweight material that is stronger than steel. In biology, genetics, and all that stuff, NASA details plan to retire ISS in 2030 and deliberately crash it into the Pacific Ocean. Richard thinks that's good news in that they're not leave more junk in space, but it's also bad in that they will crash it back into the Earth. Under anthropology, you may have heard of the dawn of everything, and a review of it, this Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity by David Graeber and David Wengrow. It shows that probably virtually everything we know about the standard human history narrative has been wrong. And then in health, senolytic navitoclax rescues neurogenesis and memory in mice. So we can get memory back if we're mice, but maybe today we'll get aged rats and tomorrow maybe we all can be aged. So what's this, Richard? In our top story, the plants in the UK are flowering a month earlier due to climate change.
It's interesting. In one of the things that exists in the UK and has been there since the 1800s is long-term seasonal tracking of blooming cycles of hundreds and hundreds of plants. And using this data, then researchers at the University of Cambridge have gone through and analyzed it, and they're saying now climate change is causing plants in the UK to flower a month earlier on average. And this, of course, can have profound changes for the ecosystem and for wildlife and agriculture and gardeners. The researchers uh, also noticed that the effects of the climate change uh, also coincides with the time of the Industrial Revolution. At the beginning, when they were doing these measurements, the Industrial Revolution really had not occurred. And of course, the recent measurements are in the middle of this time. And so what they found specifically was that the average first flowering date from 1987 to 2019 in that period was a full month earlier than the average first flowering date from 1753 to 1988. And again, this is period coincides with the global warming through human activities. And earlier flowering can, of course, have consequences for ecosystems and for agriculture. There are uh, these species have grown up together and depend on each other for food and propagation and other things. And if they start to have synchronization failure, this leads to a loss in biodiversity. And so, at the long term effects of climate change on ecosystems are really fairly subtle and are hard to measure, but because of the work that they've been doing in UK for now hundreds of years, there actually is a good data set. Their overall data set has 3.5 million records that date back to 1736, and it includes uh, species, first flowering dates of many different kinds. This study looked at 406 different species, and they can see now that this shows the risk on the next cycle due to ecological mismatch. And that's certainly one of the concerns. And this ecological mismatch can lead to species collapse. And so I would say this is pretty good evidence for the fact that climate change is happening. And as a result of it, here we see a month change in the advent of spring flowering is an enormous change. And, the plants and ecosystems either adapt or they perish. I vote for adaptation, but I don't know what we can do to encourage plants to change their seasons.
Any thoughts?
It's not just in the UK, a little further north, Denmark had in 2018 and 2020 some of the warmest and sunniest summers in record. The tourists were happy, the farmers were not.
Yes. And one of the risks of the early spring, by the way, is when you have an early spring, then the flowering trees thinks, hey, it's time, and they have the flowers. And one of the things that can happen in early springs is you have late frosts, and it destroys the flowers and the crops for the year.
I was impressed by the length of time that the data that they could come up with. But that the real change has been taking place just recently. It hasn't been, it may have been gradually for 100 or 250 years or whatever, but probably 200 years of that, it didn't change much. That's what I suspect.
I suspect you could be right. They didn't give a graph of the rate of change. And here, what they did, as I read the study, is they just lumped them into two groups before, 1987 and after, and then average all of that data. So it's not at all granular.
Right. I think it's pretty absolute proof that dramatic change has taken place, but I'm not too impressed with the time that they have down there because it's been more recent than that.
Uh-huh. Well, anyway, we know it's been since then anyway.
Yes, absolutely.
And again, I'm still so impressed with the fact that this data with millions of individual data points that go back 250 years or something like that exists. It's amazing.
Well, but nature, as far as nature is concerned, it's still a very drop in the bucket, I think,
Oh, yes.
compared to the age of the Earth. And I think that the idea that only should change and other things would all of a sudden wake up and say, hey, things are out of whack. I think that is a stretch as well.
This seems to me like it's a really extensive but non-political set of data that should help to convince people who just really do not want to believe in climate change that yes,
Yeah.
indeed, something is happening.
I sure hope you're right, Suzanne.
Now, Suzanne's comment is predicated on the fact that facts matter.
What a radical
I
idea.
have this failing.
Moving, Richard, around technology. What's this about this AI programming tool from DeepMind that tests in the top 54% of human coders?
Well, the computer scientists have been working really over the past several years to figure out how to apply artificial intelligence to computer programming. And there is, if they're able to do this successfully, there is an enormous advantage because if computers are writing code, then two things happen. The programming will become a lot cheaper, and the other thing is it will happen a lot faster. And this means whatever is the rate of change that is being brought into society by computer software, that kind of change will just happen faster. For the marketing guys, I think this is great. They'll be able to have products to the market faster, but all of us are going to have to deal with a faster rate of change. Anyway, when a programmer is asked to write a program that'll do a specific function, then the programmer first has to figure out how to approach a problem in a kind of way that it can get him a solution. And there are a lot of different ways to be able to solve the problem. Settling out to how you're going to solve the problem is settling the approach. And then he makes his choice based on his experience and real world knowledge. And the thing is that AI programs don't have much of this experience and knowledge learning through experience. And so before now, the computers have not been successful. But here, DeepMind, with their Alpha Code AI system, it looks like they have made some headway, at least in this special case of a programming competition. And in the programming competition, this is a place where they give them fairly simple programs that are problems that are well defined, and they have the situation outlined, and then the programmer has to figure out how to solve it and then write the code in a few hours. And so here, DeepMind was testing their AI system against humans competing on Code Forces, which is an online site that does programming challenges. And those that compete are rated on both their approach and then the programming skills. And Alpha Code took 10 challenges with no assistant from its human handler. It had to read the outline that described the problem and what was to be done, develop an approach, and then write the code. And after the judging, Alpha Code was ranked in the top 54.3% of human programmers who had taken the same challenge. And this is the most significant uh, development so far in this whole area of having computers program themselves. And again, this is on the forefront of the kind of rapid change that is still coming ahead of us. And when the computers are able to program themselves, then you're going to see the rate of change increase significantly, and you'll see more different things tried, because if it's not as expensive to develop your program, then you can take more risks and try doing more stuff. So it's possible out of this will also come a whole new level of innovative thinking.
Any thoughts?
Well, the only issue really here is that we'll have more and more frivolous programming, like everyone has a programmable coffee pot or a steam kettle or all of this stuff that really doesn't justify programming, but seems to be necessary. So,
Well, when I was reading this story, just a couple of days ago, I got an email from my son talking about his son, who has a PhD and doing research work for Shaw, cancer research, something about finding chemicals that bind with certain proteins in the body. And in order to carry that out, he has to continuously reprogram his computer. Apparently, he is working with 3 or 4 rather high-powered computers, and he does his own programming because nobody else can seem to follow what the hell he's doing. But it would seem to me that if you have parts that could be almost virtually automated in an intelligent way, that would help a scientist to carry out their work a little easier, make it a little easier and a little faster.
I'm sure you're correct there. I know in the area where I was involved for a number of years at the end of my career, Salesforce automation, sales and marketing systems, these kind of systems in companies can have enormous impact on the business, and they're hard to implement because it takes a lot of programming skills and analytical skills, and because of that, then there's not too much you can do because it's hard and slow to do things. And I can see this as a way where a marketing guy can have some kind of idea, and then that's implemented within their online system. And here the computer could program itself, and that could be active in a few hours instead of a few weeks or a few months. And it'll make a lot of difference, I believe.
Yeah.
Richard, a question I have in terms of HR systems and so on, and other things. Often there are biases involved in people making decisions.
Uh-huh.
And often codes are developed based on these biases.
Yes.
And I assume if AI does it, it will be almost impossible to figure out what biases are there. Whereas with a human doing it, you might have a way of figuring it out. And I wonder what implications that has.
I don't know. The problem with AI, one of the problems with biases is so far the AI systems are trained with information that you feed it, like, for example, all the great books. And then whatever are the aggregate bias within that source you give it are going to show up in the AI system. So, for example, if you train it on the great books, you're going to be training it mainly upon European and American intellectual ideas and perspectives, and you're going to miss 3/4 of the world in terms of the AI's approach. So it's going to have exactly the kind of bias that you're talking about.
There was a CBC radio program recently when they were teaching AI systems what a party was. And so they had pictures of people gathered together. But the dilemma was that the minority groups were underrepresented, meaning that
Yes.
if they thought only white faces gathered together meant a party, then if you had Asian faces together or black faces together, the AI system would not consider that a party because nobody fed that info in. So it's the old garbage in, garbage out
Right,
problem.
right.
Another comment, though, on these AI systems, the University of Washington AI system, which can figure out how a protein folds, which is absolutely essential for how proteins behave in the
yes.
body, has been a huge AI success, much
Yes.
better than any human ideas so far. So.
Yes. And that system, because it can give you results that were not possible by humans, is also something they're using for pure research and saying, kind of what would happen with this and that. And we couldn't even ask the question before. And we can use the AI system to expand our research knowledge base. So it's amazing, I think.
Well, Richard, if we want to move on to the environment, you're saying that we know what we need to do, but getting people to change is the problem, because we now know that plant-based diets and rewilding is a great opportunity to cut carbon dioxide. Tell us about that.
Well, a careful study was done, and what they're saying is by shifting to more plant-rich diets, wealthy nations, which are where much of the problem is, could cut their agricultural emissions by 61% and sequester 100 gigatons of CO2 by turning the surplus farmland that this relieves into real rewilding. And to give you an idea of the significance of that, 100 gigatons of CO2, what they're saying is for us to have a chance at dealing with the changing climate, then by 2050, we have to be able to remove 300 gigatons of CO2 from the atmosphere. This particular one would take care of 1/3 of that problem. It still requires people to change their behavior, though, and so that's part of the problem. The study looked at these kind of changes in terms of a double dividend. The first part is by changing the animal-based diets, reducing it, not eliminating it, but reducing it, we can reduce the carbon emissions significantly over time. That's the first dividend. And the second dividend is if we use the land that was freed up and rewild it, we can significantly start putting carbon back into the land. and that's the secondary benefit. And so what they're talking about, they call a planetary health diet. And Carol and I have been changing the way that we've been eating recently, and we've thought that what we need to uh, make it more popular is we need some idea that we can express it, and we couldn't think of a good name for the diet. And here these researchers have done the work for us, and we're now fans of the planetary health diet. And it turns out that eating sustainably also uh, aligns remarkably well with eating healthfully. And so the two things fit together. And so they have developed this diet, and they have kind of mixes of protein sources that they're recommending, which are the main uh, things that they're manipulating in the diet. And the first is no more than about 100 grams of red meat a week. And so that's beef, pork, or lamb. About twice as much poultry, about 200 grams of poultry, and about 200 grams of fish a week. And so, uh, as I say, Carol and I have already been doing a lot of that. The other alternative, they say, is for sources of protein is at least 125 grams dry weight of legumes a week. Dairy is optional, but if you have in the diet, you need to keep it below 500 grams a day. And uh, this would require much less farmland, and the farmland that is relieved can be rewilded. And as I say, what Carol and I actually have done on our own is have gone to a diet that is very similar to this. We were interested in a plant-based diet, and for uh, several reasons, including my kidney disease, we were not able to do it, and had started to do a mix of diet that is basically about half of the days are just plant-based, and the other half of the days we're eating like we have been doing. And the diet is good for us, and it turns out if everybody would eat this way, it would be good for the planet. And what I would say from our own personal experience, this change was a much easier change for Carol and I to make than to go completely plant-based, to become complete vegetarians or things like this. And that extreme of change is not needed. What we need to do is just change the balance, and you can do it pretty easily.
Any thoughts?
Here in the States, there's already a transition. You can get products like Beyond Burgers, which
Yes,
I don't know if you can get it in Mexico.
yes, you can.
Okay. And also IKEA, they have two dishes that are based on plant-based bowls,
Uh-huh.
two different dishes. So there is a slow transition in that direction.
Yes. And even
It-
without that transition, there's still stuff you can do, having lentils instead of chicken.
Here's Mouthy Sue again. Stay away from processed foods, and Beyond Meats is highly processed. It's got peas in it and lentils. You're better off to be eating the peas and the lentils.
Right.
Michael Pollan, who've written a lot about fast food industry and just general diets in the US, says poor women who cook for themselves are healthier than wealthy women who don't.
Interesting. I would believe it. And my wife reads the ingredients, and basically what she says now is if the list of ingredients is long, don't buy it.
Poland says don't buy anything that's got more than 5 ingredients, and even better, buy something that is the ingredient,
Okay, okay.
meaning
Yes.
oatmeal is oatmeal. It's an ingredient.
You mean he wants us to use food to cook with?
Well, if
You know,
you
the
start-
other side of this coin is the rewilding. And I see that as one of the biggest problems because property rights, you know, farmers, they're not going to voluntarily do that. It needs to be purchased, the land needs to be purchased, or they have to be paid not to grow crops. And this is a temporary measure, the
Right.
payment to them.
I think Europe, in England, I believe there are some rewilding programs where the government essentially provides a subsidy.
Right.
The United
I-
States, the largest farmland owner is Bill Gates, and he does have a social conscience.
Actually, China owns more land, farmland than Bill Gates does. They're buying up all of Africa.
And I'm not sure about their social
They're
conscience.
exporting famine from China. So they're buying up African farmland to feed the Chinese population.
Wow.
But it's the Catholic Church that owns the most land in the world.
Is that true?
I didn't know.
What's the source for
I didn't
that?
know
It's fascinating.
I'll go back. An intelligent friend commented on that the Catholic Church owns more land than France has land.
Wow.
Interesting.
France is about a third the size of Nigeria, so wouldn't necessarily mean they own the most land in the world, or the Catholic.
Okay, France is just a little country, so
Yeah.
it's not like they own Mexico or something.
Well, Richard, in materials, what's this new lightweight material that's from a two-dimensional polymer that is stronger than steel?
Like I've been saying about materials all along, new materials means that you can make things you couldn't make before. And here, MIT chemical engineers have figured out a new way to process polymers that has created a new material that is stronger than steel and is light as plastic and can easily be manufactured. And this process does what they had prior to it believed to be impossible, which is to induce polymers to form 2D sheets. Now, this kind of material could be used as a lightweight, durable coating for things like car parts or cell phones, or as a building material to make bridges and other structures. You usually don't think about plastics as something you can use to support a building, but with this material, you can make new things. And so polymers, which are all plastics, consist of chains of building blocks called monomers, and these chains grow by adding new materials on the end, and when you get big enough, the monomer turns into a polymer. And once formed, polymers can be shaped into three-dimensional objects like water bottles by using injection molding. And the scientists have been interested in two-dimensional sheets of polymers for a long time and thought they could form strong, lightweight materials, but until now it was impossible. Because if you were working with to create flat sheets from monomers, then if even one monomer was rotated up or down out of the plane of the sheet, the whole sheet structure would be lost. So they just couldn't make them accurately enough. And this team came up with a new polarization process that lets them generate these two-dimensional sheets called a polyaramide, which is a new name. You probably will hear more of it. And they use a compound called melamine, which contains a ring of carbon and nitrogen atoms. And under the right conditions, these monomers can grow into two dimensions, forming disks. And then disks stack on top of each other and are held by strong hydrogen bonds between the layers, which makes the structure very stable and very strong. And so now they can make a sheet uh, of molecular plane uh, where the molecules hook themselves together in two dimensions, and this mechanism happens spontaneously in solution, so it can be made in large quantities. If you want more of it, you just put more of the ingredient in the solution and it will make more stuff. And so easy to make and inexpensive to make. And what they found is the new material's elastic modulus, the measure of how much force it can take to deform it, is between 4 and 6 times greater than bulletproof glass. So it's pretty strong against that kind of impact. And its yield strength, how much force it takes to break it, is twice that of steel, and it's only about 1/6 of the weight of steel. So you have this lightweight material, stronger than steel. It also, by the way, is impermeable to gases, and that's why they're saying they could use it in things like car parts. If you coat the car part with this, then it's not going to rust because water vapor can't get to it. I wonder if you could use it to coat Navy ships with, because you know the Navy ships, those guys are always chipping paint to get rid of the rust, and maybe if they just coated them with this stuff, they wouldn't need to do that. But really, I think the exciting potential starts to be if you think about a material that is twice as strong as steel and 6 times 1/6 of the weight of steel, and start to imagine what you might be able to do in terms of structures and buildings and bridges and things like that. It brings about really exciting potentials.
Any thoughts?
It's a similar thing to the glass fiber composites that they're using now in the Boeing 787. It supposedly weighs enough less and has that the fuel consumption per passenger mile is 1/2 of what it was in the old 737s and the other jets that are made out of aluminum.
Wow.
Because they use so much glass fiber composites in the 787s. And this new stuff will likely be have a similar effect on the things that we build. It'll just take 50 years before it replaces what we've got now.
Hmm. It'll
So,
take a while. I don't know if it's 50 years, but you're certainly right. And it's interesting what you say about the impact on the Boeing 747s or whichever aircraft it was. Just you don't think of aluminum as weighing that much, but to be able to double the fuel economy by changing it to a lighter material is a big deal.
yes.
Well, Richard, if we want to move on to space and all that, what's this about the International Space Station due to retire in 1930, and where are you going to put it? In junk in space or onto Earth? What's NASA planning?
Well, the International Space Station has been there since what, 1980? I'm trying to find the date in the article, and
40 years.
pardon?
About 40 years.
Okay, and it's actually really interesting at one level because it was put there by a consortium of 15 different countries who were actually cooperating all of this time. And uh, when the ISS goes out of space, the US is going to then rely on private vendors to which they will busily transfer their decades of knowledge and give them basically for free to these private companies so that they can build their own uh, space empire. And so the US space effort will depend more heavily on private vendors. NASA says this is gonna save it after the ISS is no longer an expense. It's going to save it more than $1 billion a year, and they're going to put that savings into more deep space exploration menus. And the ISS has been in orbit since 2000. I was way wrong in the date. And this decommissioning process that they're planning now has a couple of parts. The first thing they're going to do is they're going to detach some of the modules and attach them to other space stations. So they'll use what they can. And then in 2030, the final crew will depart the ISS, and I'm sure that will be a big media event because it's a historic moment. And then in early 2031, with no one on board controllers will start using thrusters to lower the station's altitude and to almost enter the Earth's atmosphere. And then it'll fire its power one more time and plunge into the atmosphere. And the plan is that it will splash down into the South Pacific Oceanic uninhabited area, which is known colloquially as the spacecraft cemetery. And it's where space agencies have dropped hundreds of space pieces, including the Russians' Mir space station, for the past 50 years. It's somewhere in the South Pacific that's not near any inhabited area. The closest area is more than 1,500 miles away, so it's pretty safe. The particular challenge is the ISS is not equipped with a big enough engine to just allow it to drop from its position into the atmosphere and self-destruct that way. So it's got to do it in multiple burns, and you have to be kind of careful, because if you lower it too far, then the drag of the upper atmosphere will make you lose control of the station, and it'll start to tumble. And once it starts to tumble, you've lost all control over where it lands. So other than the fact that if they do it wrong, it may come crashing into, I hope not Cincinnati, but somewhere. And then one of the things that NASA is preparing for is they say they're going to accomplish this deorbit maneuver using its own propulsion capabilities, and also visiting vehicles. And there are a couple of other spacecraft, the Progress and maybe the Cygnus spacecraft, that it will hook up with the ISS and then use its rockets to help it crash into the Earth. And so after this, already the NASA is spending almost $500 million on several companies to they're building space stations to replace the ISS that was up there. The companies are Blue Origin is one of them. There's another one I have not heard of called NanoRacks, and then Northrop Grumman. And they have been commissioned to build new space stations, but they don't know if they'll be there in time. And so there may be a gap in space while after the ISS is retired, until we have the new stuff up there. But with this, it looks like we're at an end of an era, and the kind of international collaboration that happened for the ISS is not going to happen in the political climate that we have now. So who knows if that kind of international cooperation in space will ever happen again.
Any thoughts?
Well, it's just likely to become a competitive free-for-all as the different private outfits compete to get whatever they want in space.
That's right. And the private outfits have already basically driven Russia out of the space business, and they were the leading country for launch vehicles for a long time. And they're just getting out of the business.
Why can't they use it as a springboard for deeper space exploration?
I don't know. I think it costs a lot of money to keep it up there.
Well, it seems to be that destroying it, and besides the risk that's involved, and getting a new one there, that must not be a cheap solution either.
Well, they talk about building things on the moon as a springboard to
Right.
deep space exploration.
And the moon would be a good base.
Well, I have to question, we're trying to clean up the world, and now we're dumping stuff in the ocean
Yes.
from outer space, so we don't know how it's contaminated or anything. So that's the part I don't like.
Sure, I understand. They could drop them into the sun, but it would take a lot more energy and bigger rockets on the ISS.
Mhm.
And I think you'd have to drop a lot of stuff into the sun before it would have an impact on our weather.
I guess they like to make waves.
Richard, tell us about this new book that seems to change everything we know about human history, called The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. What's this about?
Well, I don't I don't know if it changes everything we know about humanity. It certainly gives us a very different picture of what I think of as our recent human history. That's the last 30,000 years. I've studied anthropology enough that I have this funny idea about time, so I think the last 30,000 years is pretty recent. Anyway, the book is The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. And the reviewer says it isn't every day you get to read a book that upends everything you know about the last 30,000 years of humanity. But this book does it and spells out a new paradigm to replace the narratives about what we have been told about human society and how it evolves until now. Uh, the main concept in the science of anthropology is the idea of culture, and culture is this creative, inventive, adaptive, imaginative, adventurous, uh, reasoned, consensual approach to society. And for the last 200 years, uh, anthropology has maintained a narrative based on man the hunter, with men hunting to provide for their families, and then somehow that was quickly followed by the Neolithic Revolution about 10,000 years ago, with the retreat of the last ice age, which brought form agriculture and the modern civilization. And so the idea is we had man the hunter out there, rugged, supporting the family, and then he turned to man the farmer, digging in the fields. And so the dawn of everything uh, says that virtually everything about that narrative is wrong. That's the only problem with it. And uh, in since this theory has been put in place in the last 50 years, we have learned so much about humanity with satellite imagery mapping ancient cities and DNA of human populations giving us insight into ancient populations, and even ancient pollen counts from the soil so we can tell what plants were growing there. And from uh, the residue on teeth, we can get very good information on the details of the diets. And what they have seen from that is that rather than hunting, it was the extensive knowledge of the plant and animal ecology, uh, and the planning and production and the use of tools that drove our need for bigger and better brains. The need to take care of and to know about systems of social reciprocity, of the technologies of social reciprocity, like cooking and weaving and tanning and basketry and many others, and social rituals, and all of these things helped us understand in a different way how the social requirements in these systems affected every part of life and was the driving force behind the evolution of the human. And if you look at the history, everything that could be imagined and more that can be imagined has already been tried. Every type of family, every type of economy. We've invented our society. And if you look at it through most of this, uh, even before agriculture, there were still large engineering projects involving precise knowledge of astronomy and natural phenomena, and these were found all over the planet long before what we know of as civilization evolved. And in this time, there were no armies, no overseers, no violence, no lords, no peons. There were communal organizations without central authority and without violence. And uh, the there have been times during this where there have been empires like the Roman Empire, but if you look at the scale of humanity over the last 30,000 years, the bulk of human society lived away from this power hegemony. There were empires here and there, but most of the time we were living together cooperatively uh, with each other. And their conclusions are that humans are reasonable, rational, caring, and creative. And these groups and corporations and fearless leaders have not served humanity well since colonization took over. Communal, social, consensual systems in the human history are the most common and usually the most effective and the most human of the human social systems. So, again, what they're saying is not man the hunter, but man the communicator and the consensus builder and the cooperator. And that's who we are, not these aggressive beasts.
Any thoughts?
It's all nonsense. And if you follow the bottom of the article, there's lots of comments from readers who question what the guy's saying. It's largely just a guy promoting his own book.
That is largely based on the kind of evidence that we have been able to gather about things like diets and stuff like that. So certainly the guy who wrote the book wants to sell the book, but the book is also based on the kind of evidence of humanity and diet and things like that that we can get now.
Well, a lot of the early days were isolated populations, like the Incas never came in contact with the Mayans, and they never came in contact with the Aztecs, even though they all occupied the same continent. And it was really the warming period after the last ice age that allowed these populations to expand, and the technology of agriculture. And it was when these populations came in contact with other groups that the competition for resources created all the violence and aggression that is necessary to compete for scarce resources. So,
but again, one of the things they talk about that is interesting is that before the time of agriculture, like at this ancient place in Turkey, I think Fred can tell us its name, where it was in a hilly area. It was not a good area for supporting food, but way before the advent of agriculture, there were these group gatherings of hundreds of people to build these big temples, and these are very complex operations that required big labor effort and food infrastructure support and things like that. And this kind of society that can do that is not envisioned within the regular man the hunter ideas of life. So it was large scale social organization before the advent of agriculture. And I think that's what they're talking about.
I think if we look at what's happened just within the last 10, 20 years here of misinformation, of competing ideas, it's not a surprise that if we go back thousands of years, the narrative that we have, it's shaped by interest of different groups and might not be totally reliable.
Well, certainly when I was starting to learn about anthropology, one of the popular books and ideas at that time was the book was The Naked Ape. And that gave the idea of man as this hostile, aggressive being. And what we have learned since that book says that that idea is very wrong. And what humans are best at is actually communicating and cooperating.
Well, they do communicate and cooperate within their own tribe or their own group. But when they look at these different tribes in Papua New Guinea, for instance, there's violence all the time, and none of the men die of old age, or very few of them. They mostly die from conflict with adjacent tribes.
And if you look also, part of the evidence that they're talking about is not from isolated areas like Papua New Guinea, but other places in the world. And one of the things that they see in terms of the physical evidence is objects like materials and cores that they would break down that were from thousands of miles away from where they were found, and the existence of those kind of objects at that kind of distance shows that there was still broad communication over distances between groups and things like that. And for the one thing to exist, it had to have this kind of basis of cultural interchange that again is pretty much not part of the standard idea.
Well, yeah, there was lots of trade and things like that. But when traders are out, there's not the same competition for resources that you have when you have large adjacent populations that are all competing for the same stuff. So.
Sure. Anyway, they're saying that if you look at the span of the last few thousand, tens of thousands of years, more dominant pattern still was in societies that were cooperative. And you can still find exceptions. And I'm sure there'd be lots of critical comments about it because this guy is saying some ideas that are not the kind of popular mainstream version. And every time that happens, there is this backlash, it seems. Just ask Galileo.
And I think another thing that they suggest is that there is no one set thing of either cooperation or conflict, that our species has been doing all kinds of things. And to put it into a lockstep thing of this happens and then this and this,
right.
They say all over the world, people have done this, which is different from the narrative. And their image around that is that if that's true, maybe we too can think of other possibilities than the way we're currently doing things.
What a radical idea, Fred. I always knew you were a troublemaker.
Well, if you really want to look at, they talk about the temperature hockey stick and how the temperature was pretty flat for so long and it's suddenly rocketed up in the last 100 years. What we really need to worry about is the population hockey stick, because the population was very, very low for thousands and thousands of years. And it's just the last 100 years that the population has taken off and put all this pressure on the environment and on one another through competition for resources.
And then
Well, you're absolutely right. We need volunteers.
Well, the
Any volunteers to help the planet?
do what?
Oh,
reduce the
to
population.
reduce the population by one.
It's going to take more than one. We have to reduce.
Well,
the
it has to be a
population.
bunch of ones. Okay, we need a better pandemic.
Yeah.
You didn't do a good job this time, Andrew. You got to go back with your monkeys and get a better one.
Well, these other animal populations do seem to stabilize, unlike the human population.
Well,
So Richard, if we can't think of how we're going to stabilize, what about this anti-cancer drug that seems to be stabilizing our production of neurons and makes it so that we can remember things as we get older? What's that all about?
well, this was exciting to me, being one of those older people who would like to remember things. And neurons are different than a lot of other cells in our system. They're very long-lived cells, and they don't proliferate as much as other cells. And in fact, until the 1990s, it was thought that neurogenesis, the creation of new neurons, doesn't happen in the adult brain at all. Then they found 2 or 3 regions in the brain, particularly the hippocampus, which is heavily involved in memories, like Fred was talking about, where adult neurogenesis continues, though its pace slows down significantly as they age. And the reason for this decline are not known, but research shows that reduced neurogenesis in the hippocampus is firmly linked to the development of Alzheimer's. So one of the things that is involved in the development of Alzheimer's is the hippocampus does less growing of new neurons. And as your body ages, more of your cells become senescent. And senescent cells are those that no longer divide or support the tissues in which there exists. And instead of that, they actually do something that is potentially pretty harmful. They send out chemical signals that encourage nearby cells to enter into this same senescent state. So their presence causes many problems. They degrade tissue function. It's one of the bases for this chronic inflammation that happens as you get older, and they can even raise the risk of cancer. And now, first, trying to understand this, researchers confirmed in mice that neurogenesis already starts slowing in a young age, and in mice that were between 6 weeks and 3 months, the number of immature neurons, so the neuron growth decreased by 50%. And by the end of the first year of the life of the mice, they reduce to 90%. And so by the time the mice reach middle age, the hippocampus neurogenesis almost grinds to a halt. So that's the background here. And with this decline in neurogenesis, there also is the accumulation of these senescent cells. So what these researchers did is they used what they characterize as a well-researched senolytic compound, and senolytic is kind of anti-aging, and it's the compound was Navitoclax, Navitoclax, which is an anti-cancer drug, and it turned out to be effective in killing these senescent cells. And when they tried this treatment, and it reduced about half of the senescent cells. And then what they found after that was a significant increase in the number of immature neurons, meaning that neurogenesis had resumed. So getting rid of the senescent cells, which apparently dragged down the reproduction of the new cells, then the new cells started to again start to regenerate. And the hippocampus plays a critical role in memory functions. And here the authors conclude that these senescent cells directly contribute to neurogenic decline in the middle-aged hippocampus, and clearance of these cells can partially restore hippocampal neurogenesis and functions. So the paper shows that eliminating senescent cells from the hippocampus can reverse the age-related decline in neurogenesis and potentially be effective against dementia, and I would suspect potentially be of benefit to us older people who start to not remember things as well. I did, after I read the article, one of the things I do when I read articles about drugs that are on the market and might have some effect is I look for the name of that drug purchased in Mexico, and I couldn't find that you can purchase them in Mexico, so I don't know if they're available now, and if they weren't available, I don't know what dose I should take. But this is something, if it were available and only moderately expensive, I would try to figure out how much I should take and see what I could do to restore my own senescent brain cells. How
Any
about you?
thoughts?
Well, Prevagen is one of those drugs, and it's hard to find. But I've been thinking of getting those too, but I haven't really looked for them yet. But I think that I'm going to try and ask the pharmacy in Mascaras to see if they can get it for me.
Uh-huh.
If people are interested in getting a review of an awful lot of stuff around anti-aging, a book I would recommend is by a Harvard medical scientist, David Sinclair, called Lifespan. And he's also just put out a podcast of 8 episodes, also called Lifespan. It really has a review of all the hugely changing science about all of this.
Yes, that's very good. And the podcasts then are pretty accessible, I bet.
Very easy, yeah. They're up to about, I think, 5 of them, and there are 3 more.
Okay.
Sorry.
One thing about this is it confirms what we've all suspected for a long time, that dementia is contagious, at least on a cellular level.
And at some level, what the person I just mentioned, one of his big takeaways is that aging is a medical condition, and so you can do something about it.
Yes, that's one of the big changes in the ideas about aging that's occurred in the last few years.
Well, does anybody know why those Galapagos turtles live to be 300 years old and mice only live to be 2 or 3 years old.
And how is it the naked mole rats, which are just like other rats, except that normal rats die within a couple of years, and these live to be over 30.
And maybe it's something to do with being naked.
But they're made of the same stuff as we are, their DNA and all that kind of stuff. So if we can learn what they're doing, maybe it could be useful for us.
Right.
I want to live longer than 30, though.
Yeah, I'm with you.
How about
Maybe
some
go
of
for
the,
the sequoia. They live for 1,000 years, don't they?
yeah, well,
That's
some of
right, but they
these
don't
live
move
for-
around much.
live for 5,000 years, eh?
Really?
Some of the trees, yeah.
The
Oh,
bristlecone pine
Bristle
tree.
that's what I was thinking of too.
We could just double our lifespan, and with the population explosion that we already have, there'd be standing room only on the earth.
Well, on that note, I think we'll close off for today. But thank you so much, Richard, and for everybody else for participating. And we'll see you once again next week. Bye for now.
Yeah,
Okay, Fred.
thanks, Richard.
Thanks,
Thank
you.
Fred.
It's
Thank
good
you.
to see you. Good to see you all. See you
Okay.
next week.
Oh.